He will be interviewed by Genevieve Jurvetson. And Genevieve Jurvetson, not Jurvetson, Jurvetson, is a philanthropist and a MAPS donor. So please welcome to the stage.
Hello, hello. Gosh, it's amazing to be amongst so many like-minded people. Thanks for everyone supporting MAPS. So, shall we get started? So who here is a Huberman Lab podcast fan? Amazing. So I'm a huge fan, so this is truly an honor to be here with you guys, interviewing this guy. So for me, it's been pretty incredible to watch this evolution of the Huberman Lab podcast, to watch your interest and kind of knowledge on psychedelics evolve over time. You've had recent deep dive episodes on MDMA and psilocybin, highly recommend if you haven't seen. You've interviewed some of my favorite researchers who are here with us today, Robert Parker Harris, Matt Johnson, Carl Deiseroff, my beloved. Anyway, it's been a real treat to watch you just kind of come out of the closet a bit on your interest in psychedelics. So I wanted to just kind of open by talking about what changed your mind on psychedelics. Was there a tipping point? Was there a piece of research, or where did you kind of find the comfort to start talking about it?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm delighted to be here. My experience with psychedelics started young. I've been open about this on a couple of podcasts, so just very briefly, my experience with psychedelics started when I was about 15, 16, as what can only be described as a wayward youth. And it wasn't positive, and in some cases it was negative. So psilocybin and LSD experimentation at a time in which the backdrop of my life was pretty unpleasant. So it's impossible to separate the variables there. So unpleasant, in fact, that for many years afterwards, and I don't think I've ever shared this, I had what could only be described as a paranoia that someone was going to dose me without my knowledge. I wouldn't accept drinks from other people, this kind of thing. Fast forward more than 25 years, and as you all know, I have a deep interest in mental health, physical health, and things that can augment human performance. But at the root of all this is probably the mental health piece, for reasons of my own and reasons that are obvious from looking at the world around us nowadays, no explanation needed. And I decided to return to psychedelics, MDMA specifically, and I was very concerned and cautious in the first pass. It was the reading of the science around the absolutely marvelous work that MAPS has done that took me over the precipice to do that, and I'm so very glad that I did. And you know, we can't say enough positive things about MAPS, but I'm going to say a few in light of this. I needed some understanding of what these compounds did and do from people other than people I'd run into at the Banya or that were heading back from Burning Man. I just needed that. I had every fear of losing my mind. I had every fear of having a heart attack. All of it, I think, kind of healthy worries that that someone who's not familiar with these compounds would have. And then the experience in the first, second, third, and now I'm happy to talk about the fourth round at that. And nothing short of spectacular, but I would be remiss if I didn't say that, you know, each and every time there's always that little voice in the back of my head, like, is this going to be the time that I just obliterate every serotonin neuron that I have? Or is this going to be the time that I get locked into some thought train that I can't exit? And I think that reflects just the workings of the human brain. I like to think that's a healthy anxiety and one that can be met. either in or out of the medicine and with support. So for me, the return to it has been marvelous. Different compounds. I'm yet to re-explore psilocybin. I do want to emphasize I've done the MDMA journeys with proper support, and that's obviously really important. But I think it's obvious to me now that there is, from the science and from my own experience, that there is just tremendous therapeutic potential, and that, you know, not all, but many of the more significant ailings of the world can be met with these spectacular therapies. Because as most of you probably already know, that MDMA's main role in treating PTSD and augmenting neuroplasticity is to work and synergize with excellent therapy, not function on its own. And I'm sure there are people that would like to debate beyond that, and we can do that. But that's my stance, that's where I'm at with it now. And as a scientist and as a public health educator, I'm very cognizant of the importance of what's happening right now in terms of the movement toward legalization, some of the cautionary notes. And, but yes, I'm of the converted.
So I want to dig in a little bit, if you're open to it, to your MDMA journey. And I really appreciate that you've kind of been open about talking about this, and it's interesting to hear that you've done 4 treatments. And I think people don't realize, for some people, 1 treatment's great. For some, 4, 5, 6, we don't know. So I'd love to hear more about what you learned from those experiences, how that 4th journey was, how that whole experience informed your thinking about this field.
Yeah. Well, I don't know what percentage of this audience has done these compounds or is under their influence right now. But some of this may resonate, some of it may not. The first time I did it was a very somatic experience for me, and I think that the major conclusion takeaway, there were 2. One was about midway through the session, the support therapist left the room briefly, and I was overwhelmed with the most profound sense of loneliness I've ever experienced in my entire life. And I'm somebody who spends quite a lot of time alone. Despite my podcasting role, I like people, I like interactions, but I'm pretty introverted. But I recall in that moment thinking, well, this is great, like if I can tolerate this, I can learn from this, if I can learn from this, I think I can export something here. It felt like there was something there was some texture to that experience. And then they returned and I felt better, but the feeling better came before their return. And what became very clear and amazing to me in that moment was that, having been somebody who's done many decades of therapy, for reasons at first against my will, and now with my will, I felt like I was able to run many iterations of the loneliness experience and have it in its most extreme state. And so I got to test it in its extreme state, which is oh so very different than sitting down with a therapist, which I've done many times before, and talking to them about an emotion that I had a few days ago. So it's happening in real time, and the neurobiologist in me, who's spent a lifetime working on neuroplasticity, kind of went, whoa, so this is what it is, because with neuroplasticity, what you want is the combination of feeling and thought and action in real time. They need to converge in a very potent way that's different than your background level of emotion, feeling, and thought in some way. Otherwise, there'd be no reason to alter the circuitry. So that was good and informative. And then the takeaway from the first session was really one of being able to feel. I felt prior to that session that I could feel from the neck up and from the waist down, but that I couldn't feel anything in between. And I think the somatic piece really allowed me to feel emotions from toe to head and head to toe in a way that I think if you are wired that way, will be well done. If you're not wired that way, and I'm raising my hand, was not accessible to me. And allowed me to go through a number of life passages with more resonance and feeling. I think that first session was the origin of the podcast as well, because when I think about science and I talk about science, I feel it in my body, and I always have.
So you said you thought of the Huberman podcast in your MDMA journey.
Well, the idea of launching the podcast was given to me later by my friend Lex Friedman, but the idea that I feel my love of a topic and I can't help but want to share that with people, that was a full body experience, and it's one that I try to remain still while I podcast because the camera is fixed, but it's like it's a movement inside that I try and just basically comes out through my mouth, which is why the podcasts are like 3 or 4 hours long. I always joke that if nothing else, I'll cure insomnia. And then I'll describe the other sessions a bit more quickly. The second one was one of really deep acceptance, and just really deep acceptance for a number of things that aren't going to change. I think we spend so much of our time trying to control the past and control thoughts of the past with our current actions. And the acceptance piece was enormous and wonderful and very grounded. It wasn't a big somatic release. The third session really taught me what real boundaries are about. I've always grappled with this conflict. Like you hear these things, out of sight, out of mind, right? And then absence makes the heart go founder. So like, which one is it? Right? It's both. This is why I don't read these memes. Because there's one for everything, and the refrigerator magnet approach never worked for me. And so the third session was one in which I thought, okay, this whole business of feel your feelings, but don't react to them. I don't know. Feelings are this incredible guide when they're the right feelings, and then how do you interpret the wrong from the right feelings? It's enough to make anyone crazy and start discussions about free will, which I'm not interested in. So I, and no disrespect to my colleagues that are writing books about free will.
We love Sam Harris.
And Bob Sapolsky's book is almost done, and he's got a book called Determined, which is coming out soon. And I should mention, Bob has been he's been a silent mentor to me. We've been in touch for a long time. The great Bob Sapolsky. That third session really let me feel and understand what boundaries were and how they are malleable, and it's something to work with. And then the fourth session, I confess, and I don't know, is this going to get me fired or arrested? I did alone. And it was a very long session, and I had support in the sense that people knew I was doing it alone, but that was a hard one. I expected the full empathogenic experience, and instead I found myself pretty angry for about 11 hours. And that was tough, and then exited that and was pretty perplexed and a little bit bothered by the fact that it seemed to exacerbate, not alleviate certain things. But then in talking with the person supporting me in this, I realized about a week later, through one sentence of their insight about the origins of the anger. So again, speaking to the importance of having someone who can really see and identify blind spots for you, or for me in this case. In that moment, it dissipated. So that's 2 weeks after, 10 days after a session. So that made me realize, wow, the integration piece that everyone talks about is much longer and available for much longer than perhaps is understood, although I do realize that in MAPS trials that they extend at least 6 and sometimes more sessions afterwards. But it made me realize that this thing that we call psychedelics is wonderful and interesting, but what we're really talking about here is self-directed adaptive neuroplasticity. Takes up more space on the page. But what we're really trying to do, I think, as humans is try and understand this piece of meat in here and the rest, because it's a mind-body thing, right? There's no real distinction when you think about the nervous system. It goes everywhere. And to try and figure out ways to alter our own neural circuitry in ways that serve us better. And that's just putting a bunch of reductionist language on the experience. But to me, it's important because we know that neuroplasticity is a process, not an event. And this is so very important. Everything in biology is a process, not an event. And so the expectation that something's going to happen in the session and then that's where the important work is completed is false, for sure. And yet we know that profound experiences offer the opportunity for adaptive plasticity. So that fourth session is one that I've told myself is still left the gates of plasticity open. And
How long ago? Are we still in the plastic mode?
yeah, it's about 20 minutes before.
Oh, okay.
Just kidding. It was, that was several months ago.
Okay.
But, so those were the four sessions. I think it's remarkable to me how different each one can be. It's also remarkable how, as we're heading into the early stages of one of these journeys, as one is, that there's this feeling like, I don't want to think about that, and not that today, and then it just kind of hits you square in the face. And that's
Wait
the
till you
work.
try psilocybin.
Yeah. Well, and so my prior experiences with psilocybin weren't bad, but that wasn't the source of the bad trip, but they weren't good. But I do recall that kind of like mossy, darker, shadowy component to it, and I'm not afraid of it. I think that the way I approach things is so systematic, so there's some certain things that need to happen first.
Let's get this man in a clinical trial for psilocybin, huh? So thank you for sharing so vulnerably. I really appreciate it. I think it's helpful for people to hear about the challenging experiences just as much as the easier ones. So I wanted to kind of switch gears and ask you a question, and we'll see how this lands. What is an important truth you know about psychedelics or psychedelic therapy that is not yet known or widely accepted?
Well, I think that what I'm about to say is probably well understood within this room, but is probably not understood in the outside world, which is that, if you look at the structure of psilocybin or you look at the structure of MDMA and you line those up next to compounds like serotonin, endogenous serotonin, or something of that sort, they look so very similar, and at the same time, the effects are so very different because of the way that they can hit specific certain receptor types with some degree of specificity. And Robin, Carter Harris, and others here are far more expert in the biology of these compounds than I am, but I understand a little bit about their effects, and I have a background in neuroplasticity, and that shouldn't make sense. It just shouldn't. It shouldn't make sense, but somehow it ends up making sense. And so what I'm trying to say here is that I think people don't realize that these compounds are just slight derivations on basically endogenous neurotransmitters that we all make. Now, done at the dosages that are typical of the clinical trials that are not microdoses, these are, high affinity interactions. These are big interactions between these molecules and their receptors that are unusual to experience in everyday life without them. But I think most people just don't realize that these chemicals are foreign in their origin, we're putting them into the body, but that they mimic the natural biology so closely. And that's even true for MDMA, which at least to my knowledge, hopefully somebody will correct me on this at some point, MDMA does not exist in the natural world as far as we know. This is the only purely synthetically generated compound. But what we're talking about there is a hell of a lot of dopamine release through basically 2, maybe 3 mechanisms, and even more, so a hell of a lot of serotonin release that targets some receptors specifically, and this profound shift in cognition and emotion. And so I think people don't realize that, yes, they are drugs, and yet they are selective amplifiers on transmitter systems that exist within us already. I think most people don't realize that. And most people don't realize that about drugs in general. They think you take a drug and the drug goes into your brain and creates this effect. And it does, but it does that by way of your natural biology. And I know that might seem like a bit of a detailed answer, but I think that most of the world doesn't understand that. And I think it's an important
What's
point.
the implication of that?
I think it's important for them to understand that these are states of mind that are accessible. And one of the more common questions I get is, can I not do MDMA, do breath work instead? And, as somebody whose laboratory studies respiration physiology and stress, you want to say yes, but let's be honest. If you're breathing that hard, I'm worried about other things. To the point where you're hallucinating, you're pinking out in the room, as they call it. If you've ever done kind of, cyclic hyperventilation with breath holds, you can pink out, which reflects some potential microvascular damage to the eye, by the way.
Oh,
so, there's a limit to where the breath work can go. When we were kids, we used to spin around looking at sticks and then put them on the ground and then jump over them for that perceptual disruption. And then, there are the kids that used to hold their jugglers and bend over and pass out. There's all sorts of stupid stuff that people do trying to get into altered states that are leveraging natural physiology without putting anything into your body. I think people need to know that the systems that psychedelics leverage are systems of the brain that we understand somewhat, but that they really do allow you to, air quotes, tap into naturally occurring processes, but in order of magnitude more intense. And that's it. I am yet to be on board. I'm getting some enemies now. I think the mystical experience of psychedelics is paralleled by the mystical experiences that we can achieve through other things. It's just amplified. I think the empathogenic experience, the feeling of a recognition of a boundary or an internal state is the same thing we can get to with excellent therapy, insight, walks in nature, meditation, I'll throw breath work in there, social connection, but amplified. It's just an amplification.
So you mentioned Robin Carter Harris, who's with us. He actually had a question for you.
Oh my.
Yeah, you ready for it? Okay. He said if you could get back in the lab and work on psychedelics, what kinds of experiments would you want to run?
Ooh, that's a fun one. Well, I still run a lab. Technically. Closed my animal lab.
Or is your lab working on psychedelics? That was really what you meant.
We're not working on psychedelics. We might. So there are two, my lab's mainly working on tools to mitigate stress and anxiety, and we're still working on visual repair, also only human work. I will just throw in one little tangent because I have the opportunity. I also decided in the course of doing MDMA to shut my animal lab. I've always been very impressioned. And I will say, I do think there's great value to understanding the biology through studies on mice and other, I don't even like calling them model organisms. I've always been an animal lover. This one's really tough for me. And I will raise my hand and say, I've worked on just about every species from mouse to human. Just about every one. And so, including some non-traditional species. So, it was always very
What's a non-traditional species?
the cuttlefish, which is this brilliant. If you get going on this, how much time you have? I was inspired by the great Oliver Sacks to work on cuttlefish. So he's my hero. And it's a brilliant little octopus-like thing, and they're just spectacular. And so, but in any event, to work on humans. And so the experiment I would do, to answer your question, Robin, I think, and there are others doing this, but I think the combination of psychedelic journey with focal brain stimulation to get at very specific issues. So here's the experiment, okay, Gedanken experiment in our heads. You put someone in a scanner, you can look at resting state activity, you can look at evoked activity as some stimulus, and then ideally you bring about activation that relates to something somebody wants to work through. Maybe give them a tool to adjust their anxiety down a notch. Basically get a sense of what the neural circuitry is doing. Is it lateralized? What's the order of activation and inhibition in these circuits? And then pick your target, literally, and use focal ultrasound while somebody, maybe give them an hour to go under the influence of MDMA and then target specific circuits at a frequency that we know from tons of work, both in animal models and humans, can evoke plasticity more rapidly. And then see how the neural circuits change in real time and in the hours afterwards, send them home, bring them back, re-ping those circuits. In some sense, it's a neuroengineering approach, but I think it rests on everything we know about how neuroplasticity occurs and can be increased, and the rationale for the experiment is that the increased brain-wide connectivity that we see with psilocybin, or the reduced amygdala to insula activation that's observed in some MDMA experiments. There's a bunch of other stuff going on, and you'd love to be able to target the specific neural circuits of interest, and you can do that nowadays. So why not?
Wow. Yeah. Is that going to be with our friend Norman Williams?
Yeah, so I don't know if now's the opportunity to talk about, but it occurred to me about a year ago that I was spending a lot of time on the podcast, but also that people like Robin, people like Norman Williams, and others are doing such spectacular work that maybe one place that I could be of help would be to, the Huberman Lab podcast has its standard channel. It's free. We release episodes every Monday. We have these guest series that come out from time to time. Mental health series with Paul Conti coming out in September, which would blow your mind. It blew my mind. And it's not about mental illness. It's about mental health. And then we have this premium channel. This is not an ad for the premium channel, but the premium channel raises funds that we have a donor match from Tiny Foundation, and we do science philanthropy with those funds. And so we've been supporting labs, including Nolan's and others, and we plan to support others quietly now. At first, I'm starting to talk about it a little bit. So I would love to be involved in the science to the extent that I can learn about what they're interested in doing. But the requirement for funding from us is actually, because I've been on the grant writing side, I still maintain grants, is it has to be one sentence, and if you write 2 sentences, you're not getting the money. Because the amount of time and energy that scientists put into these grants and budgets is ridiculous. And so that's the a big goal of the Huberman Lab podcast, is to generate interest in and knowledge about health and science, of course, but to generate funding for excellent research that can be siphoned in quickly.
Wow. Thank you. So friends, you gotta sign up for the premium subscription, fund psychedelic research. That's pretty awesome.
And by the way,
I'm saying it, not you. No?
The whole purpose was, I better not say that. I have to catch myself sometimes. My top-down ambition is best before 5 p.m. and basically absent after 6 p.m. Without a drink. The wonderful thing about the podcast for me is that I love learning, I love teaching, the world gets it free, and there's no expectation of anything in return. And where people choose to support the podcast, we're really grateful, because it supports the staff and the philanthropy effort. But the most gratifying thing to me is when people say, I can't believe this is free, or it's like some kid in Bangladesh or something is like, cool, I'm learning about the retina. That for me is the buzz. So anyway, I feel like
So we only have a couple minutes left. I don't know about you guys, but I'm sad that this conversation is coming to an end. This has been fun. Is there anything else you want to share with this audience? Any messages, anything, the reason you wanted to be here?
I'll share the reason I wanted to be here. Give me an open-ended question. That's
You got 58 seconds.
So there are 2 things you never want to say to a scientist, and especially not this scientist. Combine those like you're really in for it. I orient pretty well in space. I orient very well in space, but I do not orient well in time. I decided to be here. I don't do many public speaking things these days, just by way of restricted time. Just frankly because I'm in awe of what's happened. I did not think that y'all would pull this off. Like, I didn't. You know, this, okay, a meeting around psychedelics, I just didn't, and I'll try and keep this brief, and you heard me say this once before at an event that we were both at. You know, 6 years ago, even 3 years ago, I was afraid to talk about psychedelics. Prior to my re-exploration of them, I was really afraid. I thought I'd lose my job, thought the DA would show up at my door. Maybe they'll be waiting for me tonight. I'll see if I still have my job.
They're here, yeah.
Yeah. Hey guys, I see you. But, you know, through the incredible philanthropy, like you, Tim Ferriss, Blake Mycoskie, and others, okay, there's no way I could list them all out, through the incredible work of, you know, Roland, you know, bless him, you know, Nolan, Robin, Matt Johnson, and on, that it's a field now. I mean, and I understand deeply what it takes to create a field in science. And it's actually just one thing. You need money, that's necessary, but not sufficient. You need interest, that's necessary, but not sufficient. You need scientific papers, necessary, not sufficient. But what you really need are students and postdocs in the lab, pipetting, doing data analysis, working for below minimum wage when you really calculate the number of hours they work. You need a field that's born of the progeny of the academics that have the guts to take on something as, frankly, risky and controversial and potentially transformative as psychedelics. And what happened was that all of those things converged in laboratories. And I know that for the traditionalists out there, this whole notion of laboratories and the fact that some of the work happens on mice, which by the way is necessary in this day and age and in this world, to understand mechanism. The probability that all of those things would converge in a way that now students join graduate programs at amazing universities, Stanford, Johns Hopkins, and on. UC Davis has some very interesting work, so many places, right? UCL, on. Those students and postdocs are the next laboratories and the next laboratories that are going to be soliciting for funding from the big grants agencies. So they are the ones actually that legitimize this entire enterprise. They are the only piece that's both necessary and sufficient. Because with them, you can count on a field propagating and expanding. And I know this with certainty because every single textbook chapter about neuroscience or psychology was born of the academic and clinical, I should include clinical progeny of the big names that you read about in those textbooks. But to make a field, you need the incredibly hard-working young people and old people who are in the labs pipetting, the technicians, the staff that support them. They are the workhorse and the lifeblood of what you're trying to do. And without them, it's not going to happen. Because the rest of the world outside of this auditorium, I know well enough, and you know well enough, that without the scientific studies, without the clinical trials, it ain't going to happen. But with those, all of the traditional ways of approaching this will be lifted, and bright, positive light will shine on that. And the scientific community and those communities, I hope, will continue to handshake. I really hope that the entrance of tech and pharma, maybe, dirty word and on the line. If I say pharma, he's a big pharma shill. I don't know. I mean, I've taken a prescription drug from time to time, but no, I don't get kickbacks from any pharmaceutical company. The point is that there has to be the hand-holding across these divisions. But the students and postdocs who choose to work on this stuff are the ones that are going to expand the science. And when I say students and postdocs, I also mean the medical students and the clinicians and the technicians. So bless them and fund them.
Thank you. Thank you. I just wanted to end this amazing conversation with some gratitude. As a fellow geek, I really appreciate what you've done for science and science education. You came out of nowhere in 2021, and now you have an audience of millions and millions and millions of people that you're educating in the way that you do so well. So thank you so much, and thank you for living your purpose. It's so clear you're doing exactly what you need to be doing at exactly the time that it's needed, and I think that's why you have such a huge fan base, and we appreciate you. Thank you.